through this today.
Well, great. Like Dr. Peterson said, we have 3 separate videos. The videos are broken down, so if you want to ask questions while you're watching them, we'll stop in between the sections and answer those questions. Dr. Peterson's been with us now for all 9 welfare and safety summits of the Racehorse, and the Racing Services Testing Lab actually was an industry-funded initiative that resulted out of one of the early welfare and safety summits, along with the equine injury database. And we're very grateful for his work and for us being able to lure him into the racing industry from his prior engagements. Used to be at University of Maine when we started, and he used to say horse racing in Maine was a weird combination, but now at University of Kentucky, a little bit more synergy there.
That's an easy answer.
All right. Well, thanks. So if you just bear with us for a second, we'll try to hide all of our cameras and we'll start Mick's presentation. And if you have questions while you're watching it, please use the question button as you go down below at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those in between. But thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in.
Hello, and welcome to the 9th Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit. I'm Mick Peterson from the University of Kentucky, and I'm going to be talking to you today about track surfaces, international standards for racing surfaces, and the expansion of the maintenance quality system. The outline for today is we're going to start out talking about current best practices for testing and documentation of racetrack maintenance. We're going to look at recent developments in the industry standards and the adoption of international test standards for thoroughbred racetracks. And then we're going to talk about the future of racing surface testing. I have 4 additional speakers that you're going to hear from today. The first one is Glenn Kozak, who's known to a lot of you. He is the Vice President of Services and Facilities at the New York Racing Association. Jim Pendergast is the General Manager of the Thoroughbred Training Center and is also Director of Services at the Keeneland Association. Dr. Stephanie Bonin is a forensic engineer at MPA Forensic in California, and Dennis Moore, who's a track superintendent at both Santa Anita and Del Mar. To begin with, we're going to hear from Glenn Kozak, where I'm asking him sort of where we are right now and where we've come in the last few years. Glenn, since the New York Governor's Task Force report in 2012, NYRA has been very proactive in a number of areas, including track surfaces. In what ways has your operation changed, and what is your current focus since that time?
I think what probably the biggest thing that came out of the task force was the electronic data collection and going through and being able to have all the materials, all the maintenance, the weather, everything inputted into one electronic point to be able to pull from, and being able to monitor what takes place at each of the locations. So whether it's Aqueduct, Belmont, or Saratoga, and it's not just for me, but also, another superintendent here that's based at Belmont is able to see. Brian is able to communicate, Brian Jabelman, with the other racetracks on what maintenance is taking place, or, adjust what we're doing to the tracks by the information that's been provided. And I think that electronic component's probably been the most helpful thing for our operation, having real-time information and being able to see what's going on at each of the tracks. And, I've said it in the past, you can basically judge the weather pattern by how you see what the maintenance is on the information that you receive and why certain things are being done, whether it's, the harrowing or back raking or, the rolling of the track at certain times. The other thing is the detail that we're providing now for every aspect of whether it's the turf or the dirt with the maintenance that's being done. We always had the paper files before that kept everything, but to have something that is so accessible and to look back at year over year, or working here in New York with our equine medical director, going through and pulling patterns from the past, which, having that reporting is also one of the things that's been invaluable for us. I would say the focus going forward is obviously everything that's going on in the industry with safety on all fronts, and the constant continuous improvement that's required at every track. I mean, we're dealing with 3 different locations, 3 different types of surfaces, all different times of the year, and then even the volume of horses that we're having train over each of our locations. That's even been added to the data collection as far as how many horses are training on the track to get an idea of the amount of breaks that we need to have on the track, or, the maintenance that takes place on the turf with the amount of works that go out, even on our training turf course up at Saratoga.
Well, what you heard about from Glenn was current best practices in the acquisition of data and the communication of the data, so that you can look back, see where it was done at each of the tracks, and especially for the larger operations, compare outcomes and the different responses at the different tracks. That's the purpose of the maintenance quality system. It's both a series of tests that are done, but it's also a database for documenting the tests and documenting the outcomes that occur. So this is part of an overall culture of data for surfaces that's epitomized by Glenn's approach to this whole question of where the data is and what it's stored. We've seen this with the horses, the riders, the jurisdiction, the training information. That all goes into the equine injury database, which has begun to see some progress in recent years. Track information up until now, though, has been relatively limited, and that's the purpose of the maintenance quality system. Current surface data is being acquired from 14 different tracks, and this includes design data, track inspection for every meet, daily maintenance and weather, and just like the equine injury database, what's absolutely critical is broadest possible participation in this data activity. Here are the current participants, and you can see there's a number of tracks that are participating, and what's most encouraging is a number of additional tracks that are moving forward, that have partially started documenting. And to be clear, it's a fair amount of work for them to ramp up and to do the work that's being done by the Keenelands, the Santa Anitas, and the New York Racing Association and Churchill. These have been the tracks that have led and have made the commitment early on to acquiring this data and learning from it. The MQS process is an ISO-type process, meaning it's a step through it, and it's developing documentation. It's not prescriptive. The goal is not to tell the track how to maintain the surface. The goal is to support the documentation and determine what has the best outcomes. Data is then available to review both the good outcomes and the questionable outcomes. It starts with the track, addressing any concerns immediately. Then it also includes the equine medical director, communicating the effort and reviewing, and it also includes communicating with broader constituencies. The key that we're approaching at this point is consistency, safety, performance, and even to a certain extent cost, because it's important in a world of finite resources to devote limited resources to the most effective approach. This is really a regulatory or oversight process as well, because it also helps us make sure that we understand that everybody's doing their job, and also the intensity of the tasks at hand. It provides information for the decision, and it really goes through 3 steps. What are you planning to do? Did you do what you planned? And was there a process in place to check the work? This is just like the FDA does on drug trials or the FAA does on airplane maintenance. We provide the information in order to be able to learn and improve over time. Sometimes it doesn't come out well, and there are problems. But the critical aspect of that is to respond immediately and to improve over time. Data provides the chance to improve and understand what's happened in those situations where there has been a negative outcome. Best case, what we're really looking at is, this is the black box. When there is a catastrophic injury of a horse or a rider is injured, either one of those outcomes, we have the information to be able to look back and understand what was happening at the racetrack at that time. So the first step in this process is design, documentation, and setup. This is just documenting the equipment, understanding the composition of the track and documenting the geometry, the turn radius, the banking, and also installing a weather station that takes data every 15 minutes. This is all done for all three surfaces. Well, obviously there are different emphasis for the different surfaces. Some aspects, such as the weather, are important for all of the racing surfaces. So, if you think about this, continuing with the analogy of aircraft, this is the flight certification process. What do we find in our initial visits? We've understood and measured the geometry of the track. We found that there are two very different designs of tracks, one that tends to be used in the eastern United States and a second design that tends to be more common in the western United States. We also have found inconsistent equipment names, which makes it difficult to communicate. Even when superintendents are on the phone, it's important for them to know what the equipment looks like at the different tracks so they can describe what they're doing at what time and whether the other superintendents agree with their approach. Second stage of the maintenance quality system is a race meet or a seasonal test. This is a series of inspection steps that includes ground penetrating radar to look at the base and the cushion, biomechanical surface testing. This is the OBST that's used to look at the racing surface, and then the composition is tested from 7 standard locations. Again, done for all 3 types of surfaces. This is the pre-flight inspection. Just like when you're waiting for the plane to take off and there's plenty of time to fix it before you take off, everything's been inspected at this point that we know that it's safe for the horses and riders to go out on that track. At this point, the challenge is we need a very large amount of data to understand what the real risk factors are. But what we do know is consistency appears to be beneficial in all cases. The Orono biomechanical surface tester the prototype was first tested in 2004 at Hollywood Park in Santa Anita. Since then we've performed comparisons of more than 60 tracks, 8 synthetic tracks, 5 turf tracks, and a large number of dirt tracks. The standard protocol can be done in 40 minutes, so it can be done between training and racing, and we simultaneously measure the slide and the grip and the hard surface. There are 4 machines in the US and Europe right now. One's at the Swedish University of Agriculture, one's at University of Central Lancashire, and 2 are located in the United States. The method is also expanded beyond racing as it's now used in other equestrian sports. It's an international testing standard that's been adopted by ASTM International, a standards agency, and we're now in the process of assembling additional equipment that will be used to support racing in North America, thanks to the gift from the Jockey Club. After a decade of data, there's some things that become very clear, and that is that the most notable difference between our synthetic and dirt surfaces is the much greater range of variation on the dirt tracks. Well, there is a lot of popular understanding or opinion that synthetic surfaces have much less slide than dirt. What we've found is that some dirt surfaces have as little slide as synthetic surfaces. So the variation between dirt surfaces is so large that some of them appear more like the synthetic surfaces. Similarly, with the cushioning or the vertical response, what we see is the variation is lower on synthetics, but some of the dirt surfaces are very similar to the synthetic surfaces. So we see overlap, but we also see a surface that has more variation on dirt in both the horizontal and vertical direction. We also use ground penetrating radar before each of the race meets. This detects variation in the base and depth of the cushion. We identify issues before a problem arises by using the ground penetrating radar. And thanks to the Jockey Club gift, these 2 tests where we've been equipment constrained, we are now in the process of purchasing and building enough equipment that we can be responsive to the racetracks. And so the expansion of this will be both easier for the racetracks and will be able to be done on a more timely basis. So again, going back to the analogy of the pre-flight inspection, we will be able to better support other racetracks as they begin to engage with the maintenance quality system. The final aspect to the maintenance quality system is daily tracking and measurements. That includes logging the equipment that Glenn was talking about, measuring the cushion, and making moisture measurements and or going stick measurements on the turf track. This is done for each of the three surfaces, and most importantly, we've got this at the same time we have the weather information so that we can understand how the maintenance of the track has to be adapted for the changes in weather. These daily tracking and measurements may be the most difficult and most important, because what we've done with the pre-meet inspection is that we verified that yes, it is possible to have a properly maintained surface that will be consistent and similar to the other racetracks. What's more difficult is that we need to be able to make sure that that track is ready every day. So, sticking with the analogy to aircraft, this is the in-flight monitoring, the checklist. This is even the dashboard or the flight data recorder if something goes wrong. The most basic data that's provided every day is the maintenance and the weather. And as Glenn mentioned, what you see is the response to the weather. In his example, he was talking about the fact that you can almost predict the weather based on the equipment. Now, what that does do is it allows us to understand both the difficulty of the job and also to train additional people to be able to respond appropriately to weather. We also have done a number of research projects. One has been looking at irrigation. We've begun to look in more detail at the design of the water trucks, and then also looking at evaporation models using data from Precision. What becomes really obvious, though, looking at the data, is the difficulty and the challenges associated with the water. Maintaining a wet track, draining a turf track, irrigating a turf track, using the water truck in order to keep consistent surface on a main dirt track. Moisture and maintenance and the response to weather is key to consistency. Maintenance matters. What we also know is that different tracks do things differently. This is also a response to local weather conditions. It's justified because of weather, design, and usage. As Glenn pointed out, heavily utilized tracks, especially in training in the morning, can demand more intensive maintenance. Response, and of course, response to weather, which is fundamentally different depending on the local climate. So that ends the first portion of the talk. We've developed methods over time, and the purpose of these methods is data for decision making. We started out system, and then there is the documentation, which is absolutely critical. The other exciting aspect to this is that we're expanding the reach of the maintenance quality system based on support from the Jockey Club. In the next segment, we'll talk about the development of new standards that are being used for thoroughbred racing surfaces and the maintenance of thoroughbred racing surfaces.
Oh, so thanks, Dr. Peterson. While we get the second one queued up, just a few questions. When you said you do pre-race visits, is that the most often you do is before the meet, or do you come during the meet for some guys, and do you do post-meet follow-up, or is it always pre-race?
The key there, and that's sort of a misnomer to say pre-race meet, because we've got a number of important racetracks that essentially run year-round. I mean, you talk about the race meet at Santa Anita. It's quite different in the winter and the summer, and then we also have longer meets at other tracks like Laurel. So in those cases, what we'll do is we will go and test it seasonally. So before they get into winter, we'll test it, we'll test the composition, we'll use the ground penetrating radar and the OBST. We'll do it again then before they go into summer, when the hot weather's coming in, when it may need to be regraded, and we'll check everything after the winter and after the rains in the spring.
And then another thing about frequency is I saw that you do some daily tracking, obviously, of the maintenance equipment that goes out. And what are you tracking when those guys go out for maintenance equipment? And what else are you, when you say daily, how often do you do it daily?
Well, what we do right now is most of the tracks are able to do it after training in the morning, where there's enough time to walk around the track or use a gator to go around the track and manually taking the data. The goal of our new projects is to begin to automate more of that data. And so at that point, we will have data between every race. If we get the Smart Harrow project implemented, we will actually have moisture sensors on the harrow. So every time the harrow goes around, we'll have a moisture measurement on the track. The daily measurements, you think about what changes from day to day. The composition, the banking, the base, those won't change day to day. But moisture, the material will move, and so it needs to be graded daily or at least weekly. And these sorts of maintenance tasks that have to be done every day, that's what you're checking on a daily basis. You're also checking in response to weather.
Yeah, and so based on weather, I saw a little bit about evaporation rates, and we know the importance of trying to keep water on the track or water off the track. How do those evaporation charts vary from, I mean, just Maryland to New York, much less California to New York?
Sure. So the primary drainage from a racetrack is across the surface, because if it's raining and it's sealed, the water will go to the inside rail and will just travel off the surface. The real challenge in, for example, California is you could be sealed during training because of an overnight rain, and after the track's been floated and run on, if it gets hot and sunny and there's a heavy wind or a fast wind, at that point, it will dry quickly. And so you might be, by the third or fourth race, you might be looking at the water truck and wondering if you need to get out with the water truck. The same changes happen on the East Coast. They just don't tend to be quite as rapid as they are in the areas where you have the dry winds coming out of the mountains.
Okay, great. And then the final question before we start the second is, you said the base doesn't change. How often are you looking at the base? I know the ground penetrating radar is a big tool that you all use, but what else is with the base? We understand it's real important to the racing.
Well, the real challenge on the base is tracks that run during the winter, it's quite easy to damage the base. We also always have some concerns about the synthetic tracks with the base, and the ground penetrating radar allows us to find the porous macadam base. But in both of those cases, we're looking at it every time that the track has had a big change. There's also 3 different designs of tracks, and the tracks with the false base, heavy rains can also damage the hard pan. They don't actually damage the base, but they damage the hard pan, which has to be developed down that supports the hoof.
Great. Well, we'll start the second section of the video. And if you have any questions, again, just go ahead and type them into the Q&A down below, and we'll answer them as we get into the third part, in between the second and third part. So here we go.
Welcome back to the second part of the talk on track surfaces for the welfare and safety of the Racehorse Summit. I'm Mick Peterson. In the first part of the talk, we talked about current best practices, the maintenance quality system, and the work that's being done at a number of the leading tracks around the country to document and to make use of the database and standard test methods. In this part of the talk, we're going to talk about the development of international standards, safety standards for the surfaces, and then the use of ASTM and other standards bodies to create test methods that can be utilized at any of the racetracks. We're going to hear from Jim Pendergast, the general manager of the Thoroughbred Center. He is also director of surfaces at the Keeneland Association, and he led the task group that put together the new safety standards for racing surfaces. Jim, you just led the committee that developed new safety standards for surfaces. What do you see as the biggest challenges that came out of this process, and is there a way in which it will impact surface maintenance at Keeneland?
Well, I think with our committee and the things that we did, the biggest change was in turf tracks. We added a lot of information, a lot more requirements, and a lot more data to be recorded on turf tracks. And I think in this day with racing, turf races are so much more popular. Trainers want more, they have more turf horses, the turf races are filling, and I think the turf courses have become so much more important that we need more focus on them. And that's a lot of what we focused on during our meetings and over the months that we were putting this together, recording things that are going on with the turf track that have never been recorded before, and making that stuff available, making a lot more of it transparent is probably the biggest thing with the document that we created and the time that we spent. That would be the biggest change. There was already a fair amount of material on dirt tracks available, and we were recording a lot of information on the dirt tracks, and the same with synthetic, but we really expanded on the turf this time.
As you heard from Jim, one of the big emphasis areas this year for the newly developed standards for surfaces is the emphasis on turf courses. Some of the work that's being done is periodic turf surface testing has been enhanced. This is not only the standard turf sort of testing, but it's also testing of the particle size distribution and some of the other characteristics that is more familiar to people who are testing synthetic or dirt tracks. We're also working to enhance on the turf tracks the documentation of the addition of material and the modification, top dressing, replacement of damaged sod, and documenting the standard maintenance such as watering and aeration. An emphasis is also being placed on existing test methods and new test methods. Existing test methods include the going stick or moisture measurements, and in particular there's an emphasis with so much pressure on the turf surfaces on repair. The usage of turf lanes to spread out the traffic, repair of divots, and then the materials used for divot mix and sod repair. And finally, the ways that areas of heavy usage, such as the Gait location, are being modified. At the same time, there's also now a PhD student at University of Kentucky who started, whose emphasis is on turf. This is the third PhD student who's worked with racing surfaces. The first one was John Bridge, who's now at University of Washington, who worked with synthetic surfaces and the degradation of wax and continues to do research in that area. Dr. Mahaffey, who did her dissertation on dirt surfaces and some of the moisture measurements that we've worked with. And Peter Schmidt, who is starting his graduate studies, and his focus is going to be on the biomechanics and the maintenance of a consistent turf racing surface. Consistent measurements have another piece of this, though, and that is how do we standardize the way that the tests are done at the different tracks? This has been an ongoing issue, and one of the reasons that the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory was developed in order to have one location where the tests could be done in the same manner. Spreading this out and then making these tests available to other people also to help the interpretation is part of that is done effectively through standards testing bodies. This is why we need international testing bodies, such as the American Society for Testing Materials, now called ASTM International. This is a system for agreeing on test methods and provides a forum for the technical details associated with these testing. Dr. Stephanie Bonin is a forensic engineer at MEA Forensics, and she's going to discuss a little bit about what ASTM does and how it functions.
Hello. My name is Stephanie Bonin. I am a biomechanical engineer at MEA Forensic, where I evaluate injury biomechanics in people involved in motor vehicle collisions, or cycling accidents, pedestrian impacts, slip and falls, and even equestrian-related injuries. I'm often asked to evaluate head injury potential and how it relates to helmet use or misuse. I've focused my PhD research on evaluating helmet performance, and that's become one of my specialties. My undergrad and master's were done at Michigan State University, where I was able to evaluate equine biomechanics. And I would say that equine biomechanics is really my passion, but I evaluate human biomechanics to make a living. And I'm also a rider, so I've competed in both eventing and dressage disciplines. And I am going to give you a little bit of background on ASTM, what the organization is, and what it does. So ASTM is a group of approximately 30,000 members from over 150 countries, and there are about 13,000 standards that have been implemented across the globe. The members include consumers, manufacturers, experts, people in academia, and regulatory bodies. And ASTM makes an effort to balance the producers, manufacturers, with the group of others, including users, consumers, general interest folks. It's a transparent, consensus-based process. The standards that are developed are consensus-based, and there's a protocol that folks involved with the standards making group follow in order to develop standards. The standards can be used by regulatory bodies. They're also used in memorandums of understanding. And topics are fairly wide-ranging, from maybe petroleum products to medical devices, amusement park rides, sports equipment, and, as we'll discuss, equestrian surfaces. ASTM committees function in three primary levels or hierarchy. There is a society or a main committee group, and then underneath the main committee are subcommittees, followed by task groups that work under the subcommittees. FO8 is the Committee on Sports Equipment and Facilities. Each committee has a numbering system, and Sports Equipment and Facilities is labeled FO8. It was first organized in 1969, and equestrian surfaces fall under that category. So the subcommittee of 28 is the subcommittee for equestrian surfaces. So the way that these committees work is the working group is effectively the task groups. That's where the documents are drafted and revised. Once a document is prepared or is at a point where it can be balloted for approval, it will be balloted at the subcommittee level. And all of the members within the subcommittee receive the ballot and are able to vote. If there are multiple people from, let's say, one organization, there is only one official vote from each organization. And once the subcommittee approves the document that's been formulated in the task group, it will then go to the main committee level for final approval before it becomes an official standard. As an injury biomechanist, I'm typically hired by attorneys. To evaluate the injury potential related to their case. And depending on the issues, I might need to determine if ASTM standards have been met. These types of cases might involve someone that's been injured on an amusement park ride or a bounce house, maybe playground equipment, sports equipment, gym equipment in schools, for example. And in those types of cases, of course, depending on the issue, I might need to evaluate design criteria, but more often it's performance criteria. If the prescribed testing protocols have been met by the item, the protocols as prescribed by ASTM. And in my world of helmets, I evaluate a lot of helmets. There are ASTM standards that prescribe how helmets need to be tested, and those vary depending on the use. There are governing bodies for bicycle and motorcycle helmets. So the CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission, manages the standard for bicycle helmet use, and the Department of Transportation manages the standard for motorcycle use. So in those cases, it's fairly clear what the law says about how the helmets need to perform and what the criteria are for them. But in general, the standards are considered best practice, the best practice, and often could be referred to as the minimum requirements that something needs to meet.
At this point, we've already begun to develop an extensive set of standards. Some of them have been approved, such as the standard test method for in situ testing of surfaces. That's the OBST that we described in part one. We also have some of the laboratory tests, such as the triaxial shear strength and cohesion. And also, we are beginning to develop better and more consistent tests that are being used for the synthetic surfaces, particularly associated with the degradation of waxes. We also have an additional number of tests that are in the approval process now that include tests for surfaces and tests for characterizing the sand more effectively. When put together, what this will do is these will provide international standards that all racetracks throughout the world have access to these test methods and can be used for the consistent comparison of test outcomes on track surface. So the first part of the talk, we talked about current best practices in the maintenance quality system. In this part of the talk, we talked about the standards. Again, there's a bigger focus on turf, as Jim Pendergast pointed out, and also the development of standard test methods for all surfaces. So what's next? What's next has to be continuous improvement. The status quo cannot be acceptable. We need to continue to improve the safety and consistency of the surfaces.
Thanks, Dr. Peterson, for that. A couple questions about standards and some follow-up is we saw a lot of the future standards that have been passed and standards that are coming in the future. And I imagine that all goes back to what you were saying about the checklist, right? And how do those fall into place with your checklist, which you were talking about?
Yeah, and a lot of the emphasis to begin with has been on testing standards for the laboratory. And that was one of the reasons the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory was actually originally created, was in order to give a standard set of tests and standard procedures that could be used at different racetracks. One of the big challenges is civil engineers tend to make different measurements than agronomists, and some of the racetracks tended to use agronomists, some use civil engineers, and so they were very confused. Interestingly enough, a lot of the equestrian surfaces for show jumping, they actually use standards that are used from foundry sands because that's more suitable to their materials. So really, by standardizing these for equestrian surfaces, we're including show jumping and dressage and other equestrian sports in this, it allows us to be able to compare apples and apples and support the entire industry.
And then we heard, and I know that we use ASTM standards for equestrian helmets, and we use in some other regulation. What other ASTM standards do we use in horse racing?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I can answer it. I don't know. The surfaces are becoming very important, and the vests and helmets, as you mentioned, are both ASTM standards. But yeah, there's an opportunity to increase the number of the equipment. Immediately comes to mind is gait padding, some of the things that are used that are important to protect people throughout the facilities.
Yeah, and I recall a couple of years ago they did a safety range standard for the shear strength of the safety range.
Yes, and the breakaway range, yes. And
so we heard the ASTM representative talk about standards for other sports, and I know that we in the equestrian world, and specifically horse racing, are proud of what we've done in our what we would call footing or racetrack surfaces. Where do we stack up with other pro sports in terms of tracking surfaces and developing standards? Where do those other pro sports fall, you think?
Well, Dennis will talk about that at the beginning, but if you'd have asked me to say at the beginning of the final section, but if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, horse racing was well behind other sports. Right now, I think that we have some of the best protocols and standards of any industry. And the data, and I certainly say the equine injury database is a key element of this. The data that we're acquiring from horse racing, I would put up against any sport, because and partly we've got the advantage that certainly we have privacy issues for the jockeys, but we don't have, we have much better tracking for the horses.
And then we heard some talk about, and we've all seen the increase of turf racing. And when we tune into some of the simulcast shows or the racing signals, we'll see those where the starting gates come out. Talk a little bit about more. That's always been an area I thought, I don't know why more horses don't jump it from shadows, but talk about what we're doing in that area so we can keep the turf in safe as we can.
Well, the new standards that are being put together that Jim Pendergast talked about, we specifically addressed that. And part of this is learning best practices between the tracks, because if you look at some tracks, you'll see that the damage to the surface in the area of the gate is minimal. Other tracks, and part of that is processes, part of it's design of the equipment, part of it's using boards to go out. So Glenn Kozak was the one who contributed that addition to the new surface testing standards. So we're going to document that. We have to learn from each other.
And I would imagine just like evaporation rates are different everywhere, the divot mix is different everywhere as well, what we saw?
Well, and the key should be the divot mix should match the surrounding material to the extent possible. And that's a challenge now. There's been some very good, some very clever work that's been done at Santa Anita and some other tracks on developing divot mix, but we need to look at that, because it can't be just loose sand that blows out when the horse hits it, if another hoof hits the same area.
Yeah, and one real quick, I just am fascinated by, I would imagine all application of divot mix is by a person walking around by hand, putting it in the correct hole, right?
It is another piece of very labor intensive effort at the racetrack. And the tracks that have the commitment to it and good management, you see the effect because the divots are repaired, pushing down the disturbed sod, and then filling the divot where there is a divot that's been created.
Well, great. We'll start the third segment here. And again, if you have any questions, just fill them in down on the Q&A, and thanks a lot.
Welcome to the third and final portion of the track surfaces talk for the welfare and safety of the Racehorse Summit. This portion of the talk is going to be talking about future standards and the maintenance quality system. I'm Mick Peterson from the University of Kentucky. In the first part of the talk, we talked about current best practices for thoroughbred racing surfaces and training surfaces. We also talked about the maintenance quality system. In the second part, we talked about safety standards for surfaces and ASTM and other standards bodies. In this section, we're going to talk about the future, and Dennis Moore, a superintendent at Santa Anita Racetrack, Del Mar Turf Club, and a consultant on surfaces, is going to lead off our discussion.
Dennis, you've been an advocate for increased testing of surfaces for many years. Actually, I first met you over 20 years ago when you were looking for quantitative tools to be developed. What is next? What do you see as our next steps for racing surfaces and the measurements out there on a daily basis?
Well, I think what I see, thus far we've come leaps and bounds from where we were. As I told you in the beginning, I always kept records on things that I did just so that I could remember what I did the last time. But now we have all that documented and backed up and supported through you and everything else. I think the next thing is, we're going to do the ventrometer with the Harrow, the new modified Harrow where we have all the information on that. I think that'll be unbelievable how valuable that'll be to us. I think that we need to start setting parameters on pertaining. Each track, as we all know, is different in soil composition and depending on area or whatever. But I think we need to dial in parameters for the type of soil and composition that each track has. Kind of like we were talking about with the TDR. If I'm X, I'm too low, and if I'm Y, I'm too high in moisture. And I think that's very important. I'd like to see us do more stuff with the water truck to know exactly how much water, to gauge the water and know exactly how much water we're putting on. Manufacturers and everybody will tell you, 4,000 gallon tank is actually only 3,750. It used to be. Maybe that's better now. But I mean, that would be very helpful to know exactly how much water we're putting on and determine how much water we need to put on to get to our optimal moisture in the track. As you and I have talked for many, many years, moisture is probably as important ingredient in the track as anything. I think that's paramount that we get those kind of things done.
What's exciting about this is no longer an academic exercise. Jamie at Churchill, Pedro at Fairgrounds, or Dennis, Jim, and Glenn that you heard from in the presentation, they're using this data to make daily decisions. So at this point, we need to give them more data and higher quality data. So these tracks that have committed the resources to take the data are now using it. We also have international tracks like Orono in Uruguay, and more tracks that are engaging, such as Keeneland and Laurel, that have also been fully participating in these activities. However, there's a challenge for the other tracks. This is labor intensive. Measuring the cushion, measuring the moisture, making these measurements on the turf tracks. It requires staffing the measurement tools and getting out there and making the measurements. What you also heard from Dennis is now there's demand from the superintendents to get better data and data that's more specific. So what's happening to the moisture content of the track over the course of the day? So automation is needed. Well, the first step on that, of course, is speed monitoring. But more importantly, what we really want to do is have real-time moisture sensing. What you're seeing right here is data taken between the races at Laurel Racetrack. After the 4th race and after the 8th race, we were able to put moisture sensors out on the track and measure the moisture content of the track in real time. This is particularly important when the weather is changing, where it's drying quickly, or there's been a light mist, where in order to make the decision on how much water to add, you have to have moisture content throughout the race card. This type of automation has the potential both to reduce the labor required to make these measurements, but also to increase the quality of the data. So where are we now? The database functions are being rebuilt by the Jockey Club. The Jockey Club has provided support for pre-meet inspection. The pre-meeting inspection is critical, but what we want to know is we want to know that the track is ready to put the horses on it, that the track is similar to wherever the horses were working before. So looking at circuits like going from Santa Anita to Del Mar, having a consistent surface between those two tracks is absolutely crucial. At this point, though, we're depending on track staff to make the commitment to enter the maintenance and to measure the moisture and cushion after training. This is a heavy lift for a number of the tracks just because of staffing constraints. What we need is the equivalent of an airplane black box, automated measurements of track conditions during every event on the surface, and then standard information for incident investigation. At this point, the data, with obvious exceptions, you see the commitment of the people that I spoke to today, is oftentimes fairly mediocre. But we need these independent measurements in a way that we can look back and understand what was occurring on the track on each day. So what's beyond the maintenance quality system? We've got this data. Now what we really need is we need to understand safer surfaces. Safer surfaces start with the biomechanics. It starts with what we know about racetrack surfaces, and we need to expand beyond what we know to see what the future will bring. What we know right now, and this is from some academic research in the area, we know that the equine injury database has made it clear that turf is safer than dirt and synthetics are safer than turf. However, in this case, we're only talking about North American racetracks. What's also interesting is turf, although oftentimes races are taken off the turf, is just as sensitive to moisture as dirt. In North America, it was found that off dirt and dirt was not a significant risk factor for the horse. Now this is interesting because what it's saying is that the maintenance that's being used to adapt to the weather is effective in North America on the dirt tracks. But there's complexity to this. When we talk about the relative safety of synthetic and turf surfaces, work by Hitchens et al. That looked worldwide did not see the same pattern of safety on synthetic surfaces. What they found was that it was insignificant. In contrast, they found that off tracks were a risk factor. Now this is not contradictory, these are very different surfaces. In fact, while the dirt in North America was included in the Hitchens et al. Study, it was overwhelmingly represented by turf versus synthetic. This really gets to a bigger question. Turf is an important surface for us. It's growing in popularity in North America. We don't hear any complaints about the biomechanics of turf surfaces. You can hear that a turf is too soft or too hard, but we know how to deal with that. We can aerate and water. So as turf racing grows as a percentage of total starts, we need to understand the appeal of turf and see if we can even get better. So what do we know about synthetic surfaces versus dirt? If we look versus dirt, dirt has very high annual variability in the surface. The surface changes quite a bit from year to year, and the catastrophic injury rate changes from year to year. The maintenance crew can be the same, everything can be the same, but we have a very different outcome on turf. What we see in synthetics is that the surface is very consistent from year to year. While it was somewhat safer than dirt, the overall differences from year to year are minimal. That's almost certainly because it's less sensitive to moisture. So turf rate is close to synthetic, but turf is sensitive to moisture. So part of this has to be the biomechanics, the complaints or the observations about the differences, the way the horses interact with the surface on synthetic versus dirt. So I'm going to talk about a related topic, and that's synthetic playing fields. Synthetic playing fields started out in 1966 with the Astrodome, which is essentially a carpet laid over soil. But what they saw was an odd pattern of chronic injuries in the players. Does this sound familiar? The Monsanto company, which made AstroTurf at that time, said the study was not conclusive. However, there was a huge amount of anecdotal information that suggested that there were chronic injuries associated with AstroTurf. If we look 20 years later, it wasn't until 1992 that we saw a multivariate risk analysis of selected playing surfaces was published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. This data was sufficient to support the anecdotal observation of chronic injuries associated with synthetic playing fields. After that, or during that period, a second generation synthetic turf was developed. It was a shock-absorbing pad was placed underneath the carpet, and then there were also some changes to the carpet where it was filled with silica sand and had longer fibers. This approach addressed concerns with hit injuries, but not the chronic injuries that were associated more with traction on the surface. A third generation turf was developed by Field Turf and installed in 1997. This was an infill system that used rubber as well as silica sand to fill between the grass fibers. This infill material addressed some of the traction issues and was quite well received. Now, of course, the other issue that we've seen now that's emerged for synthetic playing fields is issues with heavy metals and microplastics associated with the runoff from the surfaces. So really, if we look at the third generation turf, or potentially even the fourth generation turf, which will address some of these environmental concerns, what we really need to be looking at on racing surfaces is what is our next generation? That next generation of surfaces has to address the phases of the gait. It has to start with the horse. If we look at the gait, it starts with an initial contact of the hoof, shown in figure 1, where the hoof is coming down fast without the weight of the horse on it. There's a secondary loading in 2 where the fetlock rotates down and the weight of the horse moves forward onto the hoof. As the horse's body moves forward, the toe then penetrates down into the surface in 4A, and then the horse pushes itself forward, the propulsion phase. These different phases of the gait have very different demands on the surface. If we look at the impact, while the hoof has to be decelerated and ideally slides, a lower vertical modulus and lower loads on the leg are ideally suited to reduce chips and fractures. During propulsion, though, a very different mechanism is at place. The mechanism is primarily associated with the hind limbs where primary propulsion occurs, although all four limbs are involved in propulsion, but then the toe penetrates down into the surface and the hoof needs to be supported by the surface after the toe has penetrated down in, that breakover. This is very evident in hoof prints. On the left-hand side, you see a dirt surface with near optimal moisture content. If you look, you can see at the lower left and upper left, you can see a couple hoof prints that are very well formed. The toe is penetrated down in, and the surface allowed the material to compact so that it could support the propulsion of the hoof. You see a small amount of slide during propulsion, but you see that it's allowed this material to back up and support the hoof. With insufficient moisture, you see a picture that looks much more like this, where you see a hard surface that's developed underneath, the hard pan, where the hoof essentially slides across that and then has difficulty gripping the surface and allowing the horse to propel themselves forward. A synthetic surface gives a very different pattern where the toe, during that rotation, does not allow itself to be able to rotate down into the surface. And then you have turf. In an ideal turf surface, you'd see that right-hand figure where the hoof penetrates down into the grass, it supports it, and allows the horse to run forward without pulling out. You see a little bit of divoting in the left-hand hoof print, and here you see a nearly perfect hoof print. You see the toes penetrating down in, cutting into the grass, going between the root system, but that the root system is sufficiently strong that it supports the hoof to allow the horse to propel themselves forward. So this is quite a research challenge we're looking at. The biomechanical challenges are that the breakover links shoeing, hoof trimming, and surfaces. A perfect surface would be insensitive to moisture, so every day it would be able to provide the same ability for the toe to penetrate down into the surface and not shear out. An oriented structure allows the hoof to penetrate down in, such as the root system, but resists shearing out because the roots also provide support as the horse propels itself forward. So what's the path forward? The path forward has to start with the horse, not vendors, marketing, or whatever materials available. But we also need to base our design on data. One of the interesting aspects of our starting this at this point is we have extensive data from the equine injury database and work by Professor Hitchens and others. This data allows us to base our design on data. If we match the biomechanics, and keep in mind this is not simple. These are nonlinear materials, meaning the weight matters. They're strain rate dependent. The speed at which you load them changes the properties. And in this case, we're looking at anisotropic materials. They have different properties in the vertical direction than the horizontal direction. But, as I mentioned, we've got the equine injury database and the MQS data, which can lead us to better surfaces. Using that, combined with the epidemiological data, such as Dr. Hitchens' work, can guide us as we move forward.
Jim, beyond the work that's being done and expanded for turf tracks, documentation has been very important to this whole process as we've gone along. It's been important both to the superintendents to learn as they go along, but it's also been helpful, I think, to management has been a lot of the feedback I get. Were there any changes to the documentation, or where are we going from that standpoint on the surfaces standard?
We supplemented quite a bit on the documentation. That was one of the things that was important to all three of the track superintendents, Dennis Moore and Glenn Kozak and I. We all wanted to see more documentation of all of the practices on the track. So we beefed that up quite a bit with the whole document on turf courses, on the dirt courses, on the synthetic courses, to try to get more information available for anybody that wants to look at it. You know, we don't want this stuff to be secret. We want it out there, what we're doing, and people to be able to see it. And so that was a lot of the focus as we went through several months with this, was the items that we wanted to have documented, including, you know, the species of the turf grass and all of the things we're doing on the turf course, as well as the other things that we'd already been doing on dirt and on synthetic.
So there's been a clear theme. The takeaway message here is record keeping is crucial to how we move forward with surfaces. We've made great progress, as Glenn talked about. Jim talked about how the new standards are setting the bar higher and emphasizing turf. However, as Dennis pointed out, the quality of the data needs to be improved. If we're going to continue to make decisions based on this data and we expand it to other tracks so the better comparison to the equine injury database can be made, it's going to require some automation of the data gathering. Also, having data between races allows people like Dennis who are watching the data to respond to changes in weather. So there's an ongoing investment, but this ongoing investment has clearly been made as a part of a commitment by the industry. New York has been replacing irrigation systems. A large rebuild of the Del Mar track was undertaken a couple years ago. New turf tracks in New York at Woodbine. We're seeing an industry that understands the fact that good surfaces and investment in surfaces benefits every horse every day. Understanding how this data and how the biomechanics can be optimized to provide a better surface for the horse is the next challenge that we have to take on. Automation and new surfaces, but everything based on data and focused on the safety of the horse and rider. Thank you for the time today. I appreciate your patience and your interest. I look forward to providing updates as we move forward, and I want to particularly express my appreciation for the donors and the supporters of the Racing Surfaces Testing Laboratory that have made it possible to get to the point we are and to keep moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Peterson. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them down at the bottom of the prompt at the bottom of your Zoom. But just a few that we also had before anybody else types in those. You said a few things about the different surfaces related to slide, and then we heard banking. Tell us in general, what, I know there's not a perfect slide and a perfect banking, but what are you looking for in those two aspects of the different three tracks we use in North America?
We don't know. I mean, what we've got is we've got some indications based on the epidemiology, and it suggests a complicated story. Dr. Hitchen's recent paper didn't make things any simpler, and it was a meta study, which is the highest standard because it combined all the other studies, and it suddenly washed out some of the things we thought were important. I think what is not controversial at this point is consistency as a priority. And so the consistency of the turf course, the consistency of the synthetic course, it benefits the horse and rider and improves the safety of the surfaces.
And then the two last questions I have, and they're kind of on the similar lines of, I heard a lot about the documentation, but more importantly, I heard about being public. Why is that important to you all doing the standards, and how are you going to, how do you share that being public documentation?
Well, what Jim was talking about is, you know, transparency, and that goes both internally and externally, but transparency is absolutely crucial to the industry. One of the things that I think isn't recognized was what you asked the question earlier: how do we compare to other sports. I don't think we get credit for the quality of the work and the quality of the information that we have available in racing. And that's an ongoing challenge that we face. How do we communicate the extensive efforts that have been made? You know, and it doesn't matter whether it's rebuilding Del Mar or the big projects in New York or Churchill's efforts to when they made the changes to the track in order to make training in the morning more efficient and safer. These ongoing investments, they need to be recognized and communicated to a broader audience.
Yeah, and then the last question I have, and the last question we have is, I know you have a great relationship with the track supers, and now you've been at the racetrack for probably about a decade now or more. Some of the trainers now have been confident. But what about the relationship between the track and the horseman, and how's that make a successful surface?
Well, and that is, I mean, part of that is that communication piece and the transparency. And frankly, it's difficult to satisfy every trainer. There will be different horses that have different needs and different benefit from different surfaces. And there will also be trainers that have different philosophies on surfaces. So that's an ongoing issue. So what we can do at this point is consistency between surfaces. The surfaces at Santa Anita and the surface at Del Mar are as close as they could possibly be. The Naira surfaces are very consistent. The new Keeneland surface and Churchill surface are quite similar. So if you think about the racetracks that are near each other or the horses shipped from as a part of a circuit, having consistency between that, I think, helps the trainers as well as benefits the horses.
And then a question we just had is, it says, it seems that turf is advancing towards a preferred surface if we see more racing dates, as you've discussed. But what can be done in the northern climates when the grass growing season slows or stops?
I don't know. There's a need for a new generation of synthetic surface that has some of the biomechanics of turf, but the performance of the synthetics. Because obviously, what we've seen is the huge success of synthetic surfaces in certain climates. I mean, at Turfway, it's just been a fantastic location to have a synthetic surface. And being able to race on that and maintain it in that climate during the winter, that's a perfect application for a synthetic surface. What else do we do in the winter in northern climates? I think the synthetic surfaces or some variation of the synthetic surface is very appealing in northern climates.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, so I'd just like to say thank you so much for the effort that you put to put the PowerPoint together in the presentation. It was great. A lot of work is being done by our professionals out there, not only in the academic world, as you can see, and that's what standards take in testing standards, but really in the practical world where Steve and Jim and Glenn and all the other track supers are taking that academic information and really putting it into play and putting it into practice, providing us great feedback and Mick great feedback so we could then change those models and make better decisions. A lot of great commitments from organizations you've seen. We're through here for this week, but next week we'll have the California Necropsy program, lessons learned from Dr. Stover's research. She's manned the necropsy program for more than 20 years out there now, so has a lot of great stuff that she's going to be able to share as our steward from the Jockey Club, Dr. Jennifer Durenberger, will take us through that discussion next week. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate everything that you all are doing out there for the horse. Have a great week.
Thank you.
See you, Mick.